I've always been a rational person, the kind who scoffs at ghost stories and laughs at the idea of spirits lurking in the shadows. I was the skeptic among my friends, the one who always needed proof. But after what happened to me last year, I'm no longer so sure. It all started when I moved into a new apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom unit in an older building at the edge of town. The rent was cheap, and the landlord was surprisingly eager to have me sign the lease. Looking back, maybe that should have been my first clue that something was wrong. But at the time, I was just happy to have a place of my own. The apartment was quaint, with hardwood floors and a few antique fixtures. I didn't mind the creaky floorboards or the drafty windows. It all felt like part of the charm. My first few nights there were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, getting used to the space, and settling into my new routine. But then, things started to get strange. It was subtle at first. I'd wake up in the morning and find things slightly out of place. A chair that had been pushed in the night before would be pulled out. My phone, which I was certain I'd left on the nightstand, would be on the floor. I chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness. Maybe I was tired from the move and just not paying attention. Then, one night, I heard it. A faint scratching sound. It was coming from the far corner of my bedroom. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was rhythmic, soft but persistent, like someone slowly dragging their fingernails across a wooden surface. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. There was no response, just the continued scratching. I grabbed my phone, using its light to scan the room. There was nothing there. No signs of anything unusual. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, and I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe it was the wind or a branch brushing against the window. But it wasn't the wind. The scratching came back the next night. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I turned on the lights, but again, there was nothing. No source for the noise. I searched the entire room, checked the windows, even looked under the bed. But everything was normal, except for the scratching. By the third night, I was starting to get unnerved. The sound came back again, this time accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was speaking just below the threshold of hearing. It sent a chill down my spine. That night, I barely slept. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the relentless scratching and whispering. It felt like something was trying to communicate with me, something that didn't belong in the apartment. I tried telling myself it was just the building settling, that old places make weird noises. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next morning, I called the landlord. "Has anyone ever mentioned strange noises in the apartment?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "No," he said, a little too quickly. "I'm sure it's nothing. The building is old, you know. Creaky floors, thin walls." I wasn't convinced, but what could I do? I wasn't ready to move out just because of a few strange noises. But things only got worse from there. One evening, I came home late from work, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. As I unlocked the door, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like I was being watched. I froze for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me inside. I stepped into the apartment, flipping on the light. Everything looked normal, but the sense of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it felt stronger, like whatever it was had gotten closer. I decided to go straight to bed, hoping a good night's sleep would make me feel better. But as I entered the bedroom, I noticed something strange. The closet door, which I always kept closed, was slightly ajar. Just a crack, but enough for me to notice. I stood there, staring at the door. I knew, without a doubt, that I hadn't opened it. My heart began to race. I took a step closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Slowly, I pulled the door open. The closet was empty. Relief washed over me for a brief moment, but then I saw it, a handprint, smeared across the inside of the door. It was faint, almost translucent, like someone had pressed their hand against the wood and left behind a ghostly impression. The shape was distorted, the fingers long and thin, too long to be human. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I thought about leaving, but it was late, and I didn't have anywhere else to stay. So I did the only thing I could think of. I locked the closet door and pushed my dresser in front of it. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the closet, waiting for something to happen. The scratching returned, louder than ever, accompanied by the same eerie whispering. I tried to block it out, covering my ears with my pillow, but it was no use. Around 3 a.m., I heard something new, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps stopped right outside my door. Is someone there? I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response, but the door handle slowly began to turn. I froze, paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. My breath hitched, and I gripped the edge of my blanket, pulling it up to my chin. Suddenly, a voice, low and raspy, whispered from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing so fast I thought it might explode. The door was now wide open, and in the faint light from the street lamp outside, I could just make out a figure standing in the hallway. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. And then, without warning, it stepped back into the darkness, disappearing from sight. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the apartment. I told the landlord I was breaking the lease. When he didn't ask for an explanation, I knew I wasn't the first to do so. But even after leaving, the feeling never truly went away. I still hear the scratching sometimes, late at night, and occasionally, when I least expect it, I catch a glimpse of that figure in the corner of my eye. I don't know what it was, or why it chose me, but I'm not sure it's finished with me yet. Even after I moved out of that apartment, the memories clung to me like shadows. For weeks, I found myself checking every door, every closet, every corner of the new place I rented. But it wasn't just the memories, there was something more. A feeling, an unease that followed me no matter where I went. At night, I would wake up in cold sweats, heart racing, convinced that I heard the faint sound of scratching, just like before. It would start faintly, then grow louder, closer, as if it were moving toward me. I tried telling myself it was all in my head, just leftover paranoia from that apartment. But deep down, I knew something else had followed me. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my new bedroom. They were slow, deliberate, like the footsteps I had heard in the old place. I lay there, frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the footsteps stopped outside my door. The handle began to turn, just like before. But this time, I was prepared. I jumped out of bed and yanked the door open, expecting to find nothing but darkness. Instead, I came face to face with a tall, shadowy figure. Its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the dim light. It didn't move, didn't say anything, it just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my question. Then, in a voice so low it was barely a whisper, it said, "You let me in." Before I could react, the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too afraid that whatever it was would return. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something had followed me from that cursed apartment. I spent the entire day pacing around my apartment, trying to make sense of what was happening. That evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello?" I said cautiously. At first, there was nothing but static on the other end. Then, a familiar voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." My blood ran cold. It was the same voice I had heard in the hallway that night. The same voice that had whispered from the darkness in my old apartment. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. That night, the nightmares came back with a vengeance. I dreamt of the shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It spoke in that same low, raspy voice, telling me things I didn't want to hear, things I couldn't understand. "You belong to me now," it said, its voice echoing in my head. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The room was eerily quiet, but I could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. Desperate, I started researching the apartment building where I had first encountered the entity. It didn't take long to uncover its dark history. The building had been constructed on the site of an old house that had burned down decades ago. The owner of the house, a recluse who was rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals, had died in the fire, and some claimed his spirit still haunted the land. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't deny that something was wrong. I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, hoping they might be able to help me. The investigator, a woman named Sarah, agreed to meet with me at a cafe the next day. She was calm and professional, but there was something in her eyes that told me she had seen things she wished she hadn't. "I've dealt with cases like this before," she said, sipping her coffee. "Entities that attach themselves to people. It's not uncommon, especially when someone has unknowingly invited them in." "But I didn't invite it," I protested. "You did," she said softly. "The moment you acknowledged it, the moment you asked it what it wanted, you gave it permission to follow you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had let it in. Without realizing it, I had given it the power to invade my life. "Is there a way to stop it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded. There's always a way. But it won't be easy. She explained that I would need to confront the entity directly to take back the power I had unknowingly given it. I had to face it head on, without fear, and deny it access to my life. It was the only way to break the connection. I wasn't sure I was brave enough to do it, but I knew I didn't have a choice. The entity was growing stronger, more present, and if I didn't stop it, I feared it would consume me. That night, armed with nothing but Sarah's advice, I sat in my darkened apartment and waited. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the entity was already there, watching me, waiting for me to make the first move. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, though my voice wavered. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I could feel it, the presence, the darkness, creeping closer. The shadowy figure appeared at the far end of the room, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "You can't hurt me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't have any power over me." The entity didn't move, but I could feel its rage, like a storm building just beneath the surface. It began to whisper, its voice low and menacing, telling me things I didn't want to hear. It told me I would never be free, that I belonged to it, that no matter where I went, it would always find me. But I didn't back down. "You don't belong here," I said firmly. "I don't want you in my life. Leave me alone." The figure's eyes flared with a sudden, blinding light, and for a moment, I thought it would lash out at me. But instead, it slowly began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows. The room grew warmer, the oppressive feeling lifting, and I knew, somehow, that it was gone. I sat there in the dark, shaking, barely able to believe what had just happened. But I could feel the difference. The presence was gone, the air lighter, the silence peaceful. Over the next few days, I waited for the entity to return, but it never did. The nightmares stopped, the scratching ceased, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Whatever it was, whatever I had let into my life, it was gone for good. But even now, sometimes late at night, I catch myself listening for the faint sound of scratching, just beyond the edge of hearing. And I wonder, did I really banish it? Or is it just waiting, biding its time, until I let my guard down again?